We're continuing with the topic of folklore in modern African literature this week with Tribal Scars and Other Stories, which is a collection of short stories by Senegalese film director, producer, screenwriter, actor, and author, the late Ousmane Sembène. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Nde. Tribal Scars and Other Stories was originally published under the title Voltaire in French, and this was published in 1962. But then it was translated to English and published again as Tribal Scars and Other Stories in 1974, and it has remained a classic text of African literature ever since. And this is a small book, right? It's pretty tiny. I read it in one sitting, a couple of hours. And all 12 stories fit in just about 120 pages, but those pages pack quite the punch. The stories explore the daily lives of people in Senegal and Mali, two West African countries which, for about a year between 1959 and 1960, existed as a single entity known as the Mali Federation. And the stories are set right about the time the Federation broke up and Senegal became an independent African nature in its own right. You can feel through the stories, the rough cloth of this new identity that the people were taking on. You can sense their hope at what the future might be in this brave new world they were headed toward. You can sense their unease, the understanding that things were going to be different than anything they were used to. And as the stories progress, you begin to sense the beginnings of their horrified realization that things were definitely going to be different, but not in the good way they had hoped. And the most interesting thing about this collection is that, aside from one story, which is a retelling of a folktale well known in the Muslim world, the book is curiously devoid of any folklore. There are references to Islam, to the culture of the people, to griots and the Korah, but I can't easily recall any references to, like a proverb or folktale or some metaphor, allegory based on oral traditions. And this struck me as a bit odd at first, but that changed as I thought about, the era out of which the book came. Tribal Scars was published in 1962, as we mentioned, and this is just 2 years after Senegal became an independent state. So perhaps Sembène wrote from a place of understanding that these beliefs, are intrinsic. They don't need to be highlighted, especially given the more urgent political issues that the people were facing. And for a brief moment, I entertained the idea that, maybe Ousmane Sembène, in true visionary fashion, was emphasizing what the future might look like when the stories and philosophies which previously anchored people to the land and to each other no longer held much sway. And then I found out that Ousmane Sembène was known to have a bit of a loose relationship with the beliefs of his people, the Serer. And word has it he was an inducted servant of the Pangol, who are the ancestral spirits of the people, but he would drink the offerings he was supposed to offer to them. So, maybe he just didn't prioritize, tribal culture. I honestly am not familiar enough with his work to draw such a conclusion, but I thought that was an interesting little tidbit about him. So, but the one story in the book that has obvious folkloric origins is titled The Community. And it tells the story of a cat that goes on pilgrimage to Mecca, as Muslim people do, and, returns reformed, all pious, claiming to be the friend of the mice in its community. And the cat calls them to a rally so they can talk about how to live together. And the younger mice are keen to go, but an older mouse named Inikiev is not convinced. And Sembène notes that the name Inikiev translates to a word that combines the meaning of sly and cunning. And so Inikiev advises his fellow mice to be careful. He encourages them to dig trenches from the meeting place to their home so that they can escape if things don't go as planned. So the mice agree. Some of them dig the trenches, some of them don't, and they all go to the rally. When they get there, the cat pontificates about unity and peace and urges the mice to refrain from stealing food and nibbling on people's feet. And, the mice listen keenly, and, the young mice are really taken by the speech. But, true to his name, Kiev is a little suspicious about this cat and, asks him, like, you're telling us to not steal food and to stop nibbling on people's feet. But why are you not asking your own kind to stop preying on the mice? Your kind literally eats our children. Why are you not talking about that? And the cat tries to brush it off, but Inikiev, sees through the cat's hypocrisy and just keeps questioning him relentlessly until eventually the cat drops out of character and orders an attack on the gathered mice. And of course, the ones who had listened to Inikiev's advice escape through the trenches, while the less wary ones are devoured. And Sembène's retelling is obviously a comment on the politicians of his time who were already showing the signs of the treachery that will come to define much of the African continent's post colonial history. But another version of this story can be found in Sudanese anthropologist Ahmed Al Shahi's 1978 book, Wisdom from the Nile, a collection of folk stories from northern and central Sudan. And in this version, the grandfather of cats is who makes the pilgrimage and pretends to be reformed and pious. And the grandfather of mice is the one who sees through the act and advises his children to be cautious. A fun fact from the book: as some of you may know, Ousmane Sembène was also a critically acclaimed filmmaker, and his directorial debut, the 1966 movie Black Girl, which is a really great movie I watched a couple of years ago, is based on The Promised Land, which is the 11th story in the book. And interestingly, The Promised Land is itself based on a real life incident, and it's a bit of a tragic story. Definitely encourage you to watch it. And if I can find a link either on YouTube or Netflix or anywhere, I'll make sure that that's in the episode notes as well. The 12th story in the book is Tribal Scars, which is a story from which the collection gets its name. And it proposes a theory on how and why the practice of tribal scarring came to be on the West African coast, and links it to efforts by various West African people to make themselves poor candidates for slave raiders. And if you don't know what the tribal scars are, it's a practice in many West African countries. It's declining now, but it would be that people will have these cuts made on their faces in different patterns. And these cuts would, some of them were for beauty, some of them were for identification, some of them were therapeutics, so intended to help heal diseases. Some of them were intended as spiritual protection. But it used to be you'd be able to tell who who a person is just based on the scars that they would have on their face. But the practice is declining now, and I'm going to include a link in the episode notes as well about this if you want to know more. And it's true that tribal scars existed on the African continent because of the slave trade. But tribal scars have also been on the continent way before the onslaught of the slave trade. There is evidence that it existed as far back as the 12th and 13th century. So, final word on tribal scars and other stories. Definitely worth the read, if not for folkloric aspects, but Ousmane Sembène definitely has a gentle but really incisive way in which he talks about the political situation of his people, and you can just tell that he loves the people. So definitely recommend you read. Let me know what you think if you get a chance, and thank you for listening. I will see you next week.